This week on The Startup Life.
As far as my firm, what we try to do is really focus on helping clients ahead of time when it comes to regulations and what have you. We want you to be prepared for those so that you're not calling us when you have a problem.
All right, Startup Nation, so let's take flight with Richard Chapo, the SoCal internet lawyer. The Startup Life begins now.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, this you crazy mother.
Hey Startup Nation, do you enjoy the startup life? Now you can let the world know with gear from the show. Choose from the label yourself, make your own look, and Making Money t-shirts to tell your story of your path of entrepreneurship. Click the link in the show notes to purchase. All right, Startup Nation, so I hope you're ready to receive some value today. We have a special guest in the building today. We have Richard Chapo, the SoCal internet lawyer. How you doing, Mr. Chapo?
Doing well. How about yourself?
I cannot complain. Am I saying that right? Is it Chapo or Chapo?
It's Chapo, easy on the A, hard on the O.
Gotcha. All right, Chapo. All right, so are you ready to pour some knowledge into Startup Nation today?
Absolutely.
All righty, let's do it. So let me ask you this, man. Tell us your story upon your path of entrepreneurship and tell us a little bit about SoCalInternetLawyer.com.
Sure. Well, I'm in the legal field. So when I was rather young, got into law school because I had this grand vision that I was going to practice international law, not because I had much interest in international law, but I wanted to travel. And so that was my grand theory. And of course, the internet came along and that kind of killed that because you don't really need to travel that much anymore,
For sure.
particularly in the legal field. So I ended up launching my own firm in 2000 and have been working with entrepreneurs since then in the internet law field, covering a bunch of variety of different topics that people run into when running a business online. And I've launched a couple of my own internet businesses, of course. One was an SEO programming company, and then I have one currently, which is a DMCA agent service, which is if you comply with the DMCA, you have to designate an agent with the Copyright Office. A lot of people don't like to designate themselves because they have to list their home address. So we provide an agent service for that. So it's a little mix of everything.
Gotcha. And we're actually going to dive into that DMCA agency a little bit as well later on in the show, but I appreciate you sharing that for sure. Well, let me ask you this, man. Who or what inspires you as an entrepreneur and why?
It's easy to come up with one person, Pat Flynn, obviously, who's somebody that I do some work for, full disclosure. But there are a lot of people online. I think that, the thing that inspires me, I'll give you a kind of a roundabout answer. Ever since I've been practicing, I'm approached by people who are thinking about starting online businesses. And a lot of times they'll say to me, do you think this is a good idea? Do you think this will work? And a lot of times I've thought, this isn't a great idea. And then that person subsequently becomes successful. And in other situations, I thought, oh, this is a great idea. And it goes nowhere. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into that. Sure. But I think the thing that inspires me is watching people, get an idea and they get their teeth into it. And then ultimately becoming successful at that. And I'm talking about ideas that I would never, ever think that you could make a living off of, gardening things, whatever it may be.
Right.
But people get passionate. And on the internet, you have a fairly fair forum to compete. You can compete with large companies. And in some ways, if you're just starting out and you're being an entrepreneur, you have an advantage because you're much more flexible. If you go to battle with a large company, well, it takes them a long time to pivot. Well, I just think that seeing those stories, and they're, across all different niches, it's very inspiring. It's fascinating to watch, people take an idea and run with it and become, very successful with it.
It's funny you mentioned that when you talk about, small businesses versus large businesses. One thing I always share with Startup Nation is that, when you talk about that pivot, model, if you will, is it's almost like a really big ship versus a small ship. A small ship you can turn fairly easy, but those big barges or ocean liners, they take a a long period of time to kind of turn. So when you're talking about pivoting, that's what I always think about for sure.
I think it's absolutely true, because it's also true that people respond quicker. So,
for sure.
For instance, we had a Supreme Court decision recently, that basically it's called Wayfair, and allows states to go ahead and collect internet sales tax from out-of-state retailers. I realize probably a very boring subject, but I can guarantee you there are some people sitting in their garage right now that are writing programs, that will help people collect and remit those sales tax. Whereas you would think a large company like Amazon, who practically already does it anyways, would quickly kick out that business. And I'll bet you anything, those little entrepreneurs, end up not only getting their product out quicker, but it's probably more responsive to what, people actually need.
No, I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because we were going to dive into that a little bit later, but let's go ahead, since you mentioned it up, that Wayfair thing, because, I know a lot of times, and more so the digital items, a lot of people think that they're not taxed or not taxable, or whatever the case may be. Where do you think people get that common belief that digital items aren't taxable online?
Probably because sales tax originally started as a tax that was devoted more towards physical products. Basically, the differentiation, and all of this started, of course, before the internet and really before computers appeared. Sure. The differentiation was really between physical products and services. So in a lot of states, services would have no sales tax, but product sales always would. And then as things progressed, what you see with the internet a lot of times is, whether it's law or tax or something else, there needs to be an adjustment, and it never happens, or it takes a long time before it happens. So a lot of people assume digital goods, because they're not physical, there is no sales tax on it. And at least at this point, I think 25 different states now do tax those sales. And right. I guarantee that's probably a number that's going to grow. So it's, that'll be a myth that probably dies pretty soon.
For sure. And Startup Nation, you can catch information like that and more on Richard's blog on the SoCalInternetLawyer.com. He has an excellent blog that has a lot of great content in there, so you can check that out more. And we have the link there in the show notes for you for easy access. Now, Richard, one thing you did mention was that you worked with Pat Flynn. And when you talked about, being an admirer of people who go after a passion and just kind of really run with it, Pat Flynn is one of those people that I really think about, especially in the podcasting world, right? And so I guess, if you would, obviously you can't disclose all the information, but tell us a little bit about what's it like working with Pat Flynn. And also, I noticed that, when he talks about, when he gave you a testimonial, he talks about, you give peace of mind and stuff like that. I think what you offer your clients is not necessarily a service, but it's that peace of mind. So I guess first thing, talk about how's it working with Pat Flynn. And then secondly, talk about why offering your clients peace of mind is so important.
Yeah, I've worked with Pat for a while. We have this thing called the attorney-client privilege, so I can't really say too much.
For sure.
But obviously, he's a force out there and has done well. I think the unique thing about Pat is, and we kind of go back to the idea of, what's great about the internet is, he obviously, went through a situation that's well publicized where he lost his job as an architect, and turned around and, took this idea and launched with it. And I think the unique thing about him is he just gives so much free information.
Absolutely.
I'm 50 or older. And so, I grew up in the brick and mortar world. And the funny thing about the web, and with Pat and with other people as well, is, people share so much information that's really valuable. And here's, actionable steps you can take. And here's things I've done that worked, things that I did that didn't work, this kind of information. Well, in the past, companies would never release that information. and in fact, if I left a company and tried to share that information, they would sue me for trade secrets and everything else.
Right.
But I think the real value in what he's doing, amongst other things, is, just giving out actual actionable, steps about things that he's done, and particularly also talking about, situations where maybe he had an idea and it didn't work out, and why, and what the lessons were. The internet, there's always that situation where, the joke about you go on Facebook and you look at all of your friends and, all their lives are absolutely wonderful while yours maybe isn't. And, you're trying to figure out what's going on.
For sure.
So it's nice to see people that, talk about both sides of that process. As far as my firm, what we tried to do is really focus on helping clients ahead of time when it comes to regulations or what have you. We want you to be prepared for those, so that you're not calling us when you have a problem. Instead, we try to prevent the problem up ahead. So, for instance, the GDPR, which came out in Europe, the big privacy regulation. So we tried to work with all of our clients and get them, up to speed with that before it was enacted, so that when it was, even if a problem arose, we had a good faith basis for arguing, that we were trying to comply, which would minimize, any penalties or anything of that sort. And so that's kind of the idea. It's, you can never eliminate everything. Anybody can go file a lawsuit, if they can pay the $200 filing fee. And, so that's unfortunately just the nature of society. But if we can put together, a plan and try and address potential risks as much as possible ahead of time, you can greatly limit the chances of being sued.
Thank you for sharing that. Startup Nation, Richard just said something that I hope you caught. And so when he talks about not only just servicing clients, but he also talks about how he stays, vigilant on different laws and laws that get passed. So that way he's able to kind of be proactive in servicing his clients. I think when we're in our company, sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we forget just about servicing the clients, but sometimes we have to remember that if we start to pay attention to the industry as a whole, then we can kind of get ahead and meet clients' needs before they even need them. So, Richard, I appreciate you sharing that for sure.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this, man. So you've done a lot of traveling in your time on planet Earth. So you've been to like Russia and Europe and Central America, man. Tell us a little bit about that.
When I was growing up, I grew up in the horrible, terrible environment of San Diego. And, so during the summer, our family would actually rent out our house.
Okay.
There's a horse racing track here, so you'd rent it out for weekly vacations. You can make a lot of money, but of course you need somewhere to live. So we spent the summers traveling around the world, and so I got the bug, and that led me to, as an adult, whenever I had sufficient funds and time and some way to get out of work, to go traveling, and sometimes it was short, a month or two, but other times, maybe up to a year. To go visit places, and once you get that bug, you start looking kind of off the beaten path. That's one of the reasons I ended up in Russia, but also Asia and Laos and Thailand and those kinds of places. And I just think it's fascinating to go see how other people live, how similar society is, regardless of where you are, and then also the unique little differences.
Let me ask you this, man. And if this is something it may be embarrassing about, you don't have to ask me. Just move on. So I saw that you practice law in the porn industry. And so how did that shape your future as an internet lawyer?
Well, when I came back from Russia in 2000, the company that my associate, a friend of mine, had become CEO of, that got me involved in the internet, was an adult company. It wasn't a company that made films. It was a portal for webmasters where they could learn things and get questions answered, that kind of a thing. Right. And so that was my introduction to it. And obviously there are a lot of copyright issues in that field and things of that sort.
Absolutely.
But the other thing that was interesting about that field, and a lot of people don't realize, is a lot of technology is developed there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because they need to, you have to remember this was, right around dial-up time. And the big question was, how do you get video of anything from, a host out to the house or out to the person's residence, because the last 100 feet, as it's often referred to, can be really difficult to deal with. Mm-hmm. There can be pipes that run down the street where you can move a lot of data, but trying to get that from the street actually to a house becomes an issue. So there were actually a lot of mainstream companies that were investing massive amounts of money into the adult business because they were already dealing with those issues and already developing tech. But it was interesting to see how that all played out. The companies themselves, the adult companies that were making content, were much different than I thought. There were a lot of women that owned them.
Okay.
Yeah, it was very surprising to me. And then, it sounds racy and everything else. Frankly, it never was. I never saw a video shot or anything like that. It was mostly people sitting around in a room, with CDs of videos and that kind of thing. So, yeah, all the exotic and, odd things you would think you would see that never really happened. But it was interesting to see so many people. It was also an area where, and remember this 2000, but, you really learned the value of traffic. And, there were super affiliates in that field, people who controlled a lot of traffic, and, traffic is king. Yeah, it was fascinating to see, people come up hand in hand with, blank checks and whatever to get that traffic and what they would pay for that. And so it was fascinating. The other thing that was fascinating was the money movement. One of the things that was interesting was a lot of the money that was being processed, because it was adult, it was considered high risk in the credit field. and the chargeback fees were, phenomenally high. And it was hard to find banks that would process those transactions. So one of the interesting things was a lot of the transactions ended up going through banks in the Mideast.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, which you would never really think. Israel and other places, and so the whole industry was just it was wild to watch, but it was interesting, to see them develop and to see them really push a lot of the tech that now is used by basic sites online, be it YouTube or whatever.
It's funny you mentioned that they're like innovative in tech, because I remember recently reading an article to where it was actually the video game industry and the adult film industry, which is why we use Blu-ray as a whole. Because I think at the time it was a HD DVD and it was Blu-ray, and people were trying to decide which one was best. But when the adult film industry and the video game industry went with Blu-ray, that made everybody else kind of follow suit. So I'm actually glad you pointed that out. That was actually pretty fascinating.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true. And the strange thing is there are a lot of technological advancements and choices between platforms that are made on that kind of a basis, not just necessarily that's adult, but
for sure,
sports, things of that sort. How do you move sports broadcasts? The sporting licensing industry is very bizarre. It's kind of its own beast. And so you end up with things like the NFL, where they show, they'll have a package where they only show games that have already been completed, versus Major League Baseball, who's really kind of gone nuts with the internet.
Absolutely.
And they're all over it, and then they in fact are licensing out their structure to other sports leagues, and it's just this mess of licensing issues that you see that most people don't think about. But sometimes when you're on your TV and you're trying to wonder why the channels are so weird and why the choices are so odd, that's kind of the reason why.
Gotcha. So let me ask you this, man. You talk about the crap your pants copyright infringement letter that people get from time to time. So let's say you get one and you're like, oh my goodness, what do I do next? What are my next steps? Or, first, how can I avoid one? And let's say I don't listen. And let's say if I get one, what are my next steps?
Right. So we're talking about copyright infringement.
Sure.
Copyright infringement is kind of an antiquated area of law. So you have to remember if you think about pre-internet, the idea of actually copying something, reproducing it, and selling it was an expensive affair. I mean, you wouldn't go out and take a Stephen King paper novel, pull out each page, copy them, and then publish new books comprised of all those copies. I mean, it would just be too labor intensive.
Right.
But obviously, the beauty of the internet is you can just right click, save, and republish somewhere else. And so the question becomes, well, people are so comfortable doing that, particularly, and it's not because there's some devious conduct. I mean, there can be in some cases, but
sure,
a lot of it is we live in a sharing economy now online.
Absolutely.
People want you to share their content usually. So sometimes it's hard to understand, what is copyright infringement and what is not. Basically, you need permission to use almost anything that you see online, unless you have what's called a fair use defense, which we can talk about a bit. But any kind of graphic, text, image, video, you need some permission there. So whenever you're going to use something, you need to just ask yourself, do I have permission to use this? And if it's so, for instance, if it's a YouTube video, well, if you can use the share button, that person who posted the video has given you a license to use it. You may not realize it, but that's part of the YouTube terms.
Gotcha.
But if you go to another site or a random site and you see something that you think is interesting and you just copy it, well, in that situation, you may not have authority. So it's important to understand that if you're creating your own product, if you're an entrepreneur, you have your own site, whatever it may be, I'd really encourage you just to create your own content.
Absolutely.
With smartphones these days and with the programs that are out there for editing and what have you, it isn't that hard. And if you create your own content, there are two benefits. One, you're never going to have an infringement problem. And two, it's going to give you more credibility because people know what stock images are and they know what shared content is. But if they see something that's original that you've created that's nowhere else online, that's going to benefit you.
Got you. Two follow-up questions, actually, Richard, if I may. The first is, and you brought it up, the Fair Use Act, I believe you brought it up. When does that apply? And then also, if, you mentioned about, if I'm an entrepreneur and, we have the power to create our own content, which is very important, Startup Nation, you really do remember that. But, when we create our own content, are we automatically protected, or should we get more protections to that content that's, that we created?
Well, why don't we start with the content, because that'll lead into the fair use question.
Okay.
So if you create content, so you take an image, you shoot a video, you write a blog post, whatever it may be, you, in the United States, at least, you are given I'll refer to as common law copyright. Is that it's yours. You're automatically given that right. However, you can't enforce it. And to enforce it, you have to actually register it with the United States Copyright Office. It's only $35 or $55, depending on what you're doing. So it's cheap. It's easy to do. It's not a big deal. But one of the things to understand that's really important is if you register that within the first 90 days of putting it out, you can get what are called statutory damages if somebody infringes on your copyright. And so what that means is, let's take a blog post and say you have a site that has, 500 posts. It's been up for 3 or 4 years, whatever it is.
Okay.
And we have an image on one of those blog posts from 6 months ago. And it turns out that image is infringing. Well, what are the damages associated with that? What is the damage to the copyright owner? What should they get for that? Well, if you've registered that copyright within the first 90 days, a judge can then, or jury, depending on the situation, can assign damages between $200 for the infringement up to $150,000.
Wow.
Right. And that range is based kind of on your conduct. What happened, once it was raised, were you doing it intentionally and maliciously, all these different things. But if you don't register within that first 90 days, then you more or less have to prove actual damages.
Okay.
There are different approaches, but if we have a blog that's 500 pages and this is one page from 6 months ago and it's one image on that one page, and you can buy a stock image, from one of the stock image sites for $2, well, what's your damage? You're going to have a lot harder time proving it's a significant figure. And at that point, the problem from a legal perspective is, if you have to pay an attorney $50,000 to go hunt it down, to pursue the case, well, your return on investment's not going to be great, and that's probably not going to be a direction you want to go. So that's the kind of the big issue with that. Now, the fair use defense is just a defense to copyright infringement. That's a lot of people like to get into the technical aspects of it. I like to think of it as societal choices. Okay. There are certain elements of society that we're going to encourage and we're always going to protect. So, for instance, parody. As a society, at some point, we decided, making fun of things is something that should always be allowed.
Right.
So whether it's a video, whatever, you see these different things, and that has a value. So that's always going to be a fair use defense. And then we look at things like criticism. So on YouTube, let's take an easy example: movies. You'll see people do movie reviews, and they'll have maybe they do the review over the trailer, or they cut a piece of the trailer, or whatever. Well, that's a form of criticism, and we always want that in society. We want people to have the ability to criticize, and criticism doesn't mean necessarily negative; it can be positive as well.
Or just necessarily just give commentary, right?
Right. And here's what I think of this and that and the other, because that's good for society. We want that kind of information exchange.
For sure.
So if you think about it in the big picture like that, it can help you understand. As far as the technical questions, there are really 4 questions that a court's going to look at. One is the purpose and character of your use. So are you copying the content verbatim, or have you changed it in some way, or are you copying only a small amount? The nature of the copyrighted work. So is it something that's completely original? So let's say the first Harry Potter book would probably be pretty original. It's going to have a lot of heft and value to it, versus something like an entry on the CIA website where they just list a bunch of timeline facts. Well, that's not going to have much weight because those are just facts, and you can't copyright facts because facts are universal. Nobody owns a fact. For sure. 3, the amount and substantiality of the portion taken. So again, are you taking a small amount, or are you copying the whole thing? And then 4, the effect on the potential market for the copyright owner. So you're going to hurt people's sales. And courts then get into a situation where they weigh all these 4, and you get results that sometimes are a little head scratching. But the bigger point is that, excuse me, in a lot of these situations, it's not entirely clear. So you end up with cases like the dancing baby case, which, it's a YouTube video of a woman, and she has her baby, and the baby's dancing, and there's a 20-second clip of a Prince song. The music publisher sued, and this case went on for 10 years.
Wow.
Arguing about, is it fair use? Is it not? Is it infringement? Is it not? Okay, we have an answer. Who owes attorney fees to who? And, and it literally it was just a boondoggle. I mean, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of court resources. And the music industry is kind of a little out of control at times. But it gives you kind of an idea of fair use. The thing to understand about fair use is really almost always determined at trial.
Gotcha.
So if you think you have a fair use defense, that's great. But just keep in mind that you may have to actually, put it forth at trial, and that's going to cost you money.
Thank you for sharing that. And so that kind of brings me to my next question, because right now we have a very popular game across many platforms called Fortnite, right? And in that game, there's a lot of different dances that a lot of the players can use, right? And some of these dances are very popular in pop culture. Forgive the redundancy. They're very popular in pop culture. And so some of the creators of those dances are saying, hey, that's my dance. And Fortnite, you may not know this, has made billions of dollars already. It's a free game, but they make a lot of their money from downloadable content or extra content or whatever the case may be. What could those people the rapper, or even Alfonso Ribeiro from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, he's actually trying to have some legal action take place as well. What could they have done beforehand, before Fortnite came and kind of appropriated the dance, if you will?
I don't play video games per se. Well, I tried once and got destroyed by a 6-year-old. So
gotcha. It's just that when we told people that we were going to come on the show, we told Startup Nation that you were going to come on the show. This is one of those questions they wanted us to ask. So that's kind of why I put it out there for sure.
Okay. Well, a couple of issues come to mind. The obvious would be copyright. Most people think copyright applies to only something like a book, but it can apply to a performance.
For sure.
So if you think about a band playing a live version of one of their songs, well, that's a copyrightable performance. And so in that case, whether it's a rapper or somebody from TV show, they could certainly try to assert that. The question I would have is, did they ever originally register that copyright? And I would tend to think they probably didn't, because that's a rather esoteric subject.
Right.
The other thing that they could potentially go after is, you could almost argue a right of publicity, or the misuse of their likeness. It would depend how close. I mean, it would be new law. See, this is one of the things that's interesting about practicing internet law. In traditional law, most of the key things are really settled.
For sure.
There's been hundreds of years of decisions. Well, the internet's only been around for, as a commercial medium for maybe 20 years.
Right.
And the legal system moves really slow. So you get these questions where it's like, that's an interesting question. And so I would think that they would probably definitely pursue it, because if the game is making a lot of money and they're incorporating, their conduct, and that conduct is popular and potentially popularizing the game, then certainly, that claim is going to be something that they're going to look at. But I would think those two things would probably be issue. Are either of those going to be easily proved? Ooh, that's probably not. But it is going to be an interesting case, and I could definitely see, lawsuits filed. I don't know if either of those groups have actually filed lawsuits yet, but I could see that, they probably would at some point.
For sure. And I wanted to ask, because I wanted to get your take, because I've heard the answer you gave, and then I've also heard people say, well, under intellectual law, and forgive me if I mess any of this up, please don't shun me. I'm not a lawyer, but I've read that under intellectual law, you have to have at least 2 consecutive choreographed moves that don't mirror each other or something like that, and then you'll have a case. But I kind of wanted to get your take from an actual lawyer, because you know how Facebook groups and stuff, people go on their legal theories, and none of us are lawyers, right? So I kind of wanted to get your take on that for sure.
Well, at that point, you're looking really almost primarily at music copyright law. And to be honest, I don't really practice in that area.
For sure.
The reason being is that music copyright is kind of unique, because it breaks down into a variety of subcopyrights.
Gotcha.
So you have the mechanical copyright, you have the performance copyright, and those types of areas. It gets very complex. So there's actually attorneys that tend to specialize in that field. I would definitely think that there's at least the genesis of a copyright claim. Because again, the performance, the more, if we go back and we look at the fair use defense,
right,
take that element out, the amount and substantiality of the portion taken. Well, if it's the entire dance, it's going to be pretty hard for somebody to argue that, it's not quote unquote enough. One of the defenses that you'll see in copyright sometimes is that there's not enough of a creative work and not enough of a work for it to be considered a creative effort.
Right.
So think about this is going to be a bizarre example, but think about recipes. Recipe for food. A lot of time you can't copyright that because there's nothing really creative there, and it's typically short. Add eggs, add butter, whatever it is.
Right.
But as an overall presence, if you have pictures of the food and you have a video of somebody explaining how to actually take the recipe from point one to the end product, that is copyrightable because that's creative. There's more, if you will.
Right.
So I think if Fortnite's using just a tiny bit of the dances, it's probably going to be a difficult road to hoe for the people who came up with the original dances. But if it's the full dances, well, then there's a little bit more merit to that claim.
Gotcha. Well, like I said, like those dances, they are really pretty much like a very singular move. So it kind of leads to what you were saying, that it's not much of a bigger choreographed move. So I thank you for sharing that. I really do appreciate that, Richard, for sure. Because like I said, we got a lot of questions about that one for sure.
One thing people might want to do is just set up a Google alert for the case.
For sure.
And then you'll get emails, every couple months or whatever it is, and you see how the court starts ruling on it. It'll be interesting to see what they do.
Absolutely. And I think to add to that, Richard, thank you for sharing that. I think to add to that, Startup Nation, this will allow you to also think about your business and anything that you may think may, infringe upon your copyright or protected content or whatever the case may be. Look at this case as something that you can learn from and see if you can use that in your business. So thank you so much, Rich. I really do appreciate that for sure. Let me ask you this, man. I want to ask you about your agency, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. Tell us, our listeners, why, they should be complying with DMCA.
So the DMCA is a federal law. It was enacted in 1998 and addresses copyright online, copyright infringement situations. And the concern that Congress had at the time was that the court system would be overwhelmed by just a zillion different infringement claims because it's so much more easy to infringe online than when we had the traditional brick and mortar economy. And so they put this act together, and what it contains, for the purposes of discussions, we're looking at Section 512, and it contains a safe harbor provision. And it says that if a website is not actively posting something, then it cannot be held liable for copyright infringement for user-generated content.
Okay.
So let's say we take Facebook or whoever. Facebook's always the easy example. Somebody copies a video from some site, doesn't have permission to use it, is infringing, and they post it to their Facebook page. At that point, under the DMCA, the person who posted it can be held liable for copyright infringement, but Facebook cannot, so long as Facebook follows a certain procedure. And that procedure is basically the copyright owner would submit a complaint. It's called DMCA takedown notice. It's a simple form. You can find it online. It's not a big deal. It would submit that, and Facebook would then take down the content. They would send a message to the person who originally posted the content saying, hey, we received a complaint for copyright infringement. And then at that point, the person who's posted it can either file what's called a counter notification, or they can just drop it. And if they drop it and they don't reply, usually that's the end of it because the copyright owner is happy that the video is down, and everybody just walks away. But that's the process. So as part of that process, when the copyright owner goes to submit their complaint to Facebook, they're going to submit it to what's called the DMCA agent. And each company, online business, to comply has to designate an agent. So if you're an entrepreneur just starting out, you can designate yourself. There doesn't have to be any particular certification or anything else to be an agent. But the problem is under the Copyright Office rules, because the Copyright Office didn't really think this through, they require you to list your real business address and your phone number and your email address. Gotcha. So the problem is if you're working from home.
Right. Which a lot of people who create digital content do, right? Right.
So in a worst case scenario, in a best case scenario, you're going to get, added to spam list and to sales call list. In a worst case scenario, a quote unquote fan may show up at your door. And so, there's problems with that. So with our service, we act as your agent, basically. That's the deal.
Gotcha.
and we list our information, and we're allowed as the agent to list a PO box, and so we get around some of the problems that it provides. And it's a whopping $70 a year, but that's the service that we provide. But regardless, if you're allowing people to post on your website or your app to upload any content, even if it's just comments, you should really comply with the DMCA, because it's immunity. You're exempt from copyright infringement, and it's not very difficult to do. In fact, you can go onto Amazon. There's a book called the DMCA Handbook.
Okay.
I think it's maybe $70, which sounds like a lot, but it's a lot cheaper than an attorney. And you can buy the book and do it yourself and gain an understanding. But you're essentially, copyright infringement is probably the most common legal claim that you'll see online, and this is giving you immunity from that for anything that your users do. So it's definitely worth the $70.
And Startup Nation, if you feel like this is something that can add value to your business, DMCAagentservice.com is there for you in the show notes for easy access if you feel like that's something that you need for your business as well. Also, the link to that book that Richard just mentioned is also there for easy access as well. Thank you for sharing that, Richard. This is good stuff, man. I really appreciate your time today, for sure.
My pleasure.
Real quick before we go to break, man, what does your average day look like from sun up to sundown? What does your day look like? Be as specific as possible.
Oh, I wake up about probably 6:30 or 7 because my dog gets in my face.
Gotcha.
And he is an enthusiastic fan of breakfast. And then I pound. Yes, indeed. Well, I'm actually a night person, so I usually pound.
Gotcha.
Pound the snooze button 400 or 500 times to go back to sleep. But then get up and work, throughout the morning, work on, client matters, whatever is involved there. And then in the afternoon, I typically, if there's anything pressing, I'll work on it. But then I'll usually switch to marketing or any other issues, that are going on that are separate from what, clients need at that time.
For sure.
Be anything, bookkeeping, whatever. And then late in the afternoon, head out. Usually go for a walk. Actually take the dog. I live up in a national forest.
Okay.
So, we get out there and pray not to get taken down by a mountain lion. But other than that, it's beautiful and relaxing. The legal field can be highly stressful. So
I imagine so.
Yes. So getting out and, stretching the legs a little bit is always good for the old brain. And then evening, I usually, it just kind of depends on the week, but I'm a big fan of hockey. So I often watch hockey, scream at the TV, and that's another stress reliever, particularly when you're an LA Kings fan and they're terrible. The worst dead last team in the NHL. So it's been a rough year. But other than that, then hang out with the various love interests of the month going on there.
Gotcha. Fair enough. So we're going to go ahead and take a quick break. How you like being on the Startup Life so far, Richard?
Enjoying it. It's great.
All right, Startup Nation. So I hope you're getting great value from Richard's content, but we got to pay a few bills. Once again, my name is Dominic Lawson, and you're listening to The Startup Life. Hey business owner, the Startup Life reach is growing. Wouldn't you like your business to grow with it? Reach out to us to advertise on the Startup Life. You can reach us at 901-857-4818, or you can email me at dominic@askalsolutions.com. I mean, don't get me wrong, like this is a great music to have a break on, but wouldn't this break sound a lot better with the same music but your business being advertised on it? Need more content from the Startup Life, you say? You can now sign up for the Startup Life All Access Pass on the Binge Podcast Network's Patreon page. There is exclusive content written by yours truly, video content where I share even more of my business philosophies, and whatever crazy content I can think of out of that crazy head of mine. And at only $5 a month, yeah, $5 a month, this is more content for you, Startup Nation, to really get ahead of your competition. So instead of upsizing that meal at your favorite fast food joint, you can now invest in yourself on your path to entrepreneurship. Click the link in the show notes to sign up.
All right, Startup Nation, so let's continue. So, Richard, as the founder of SoCalInternet.lawyer.com, you help internet entrepreneurs be legally compliant with launching and stuff like that. So, what are some legal steps a person should take when launching an online business?
Well, they're the usual ones that people hear about, form a business entity and what have you. I think some of the lesser known ones that can really help you avoid problems, particularly down the line, are to first, start out and not only have a business plan, but really think about, the founders, how you're setting up this business. If you're running the business on your own, you don't really need to worry about, any of these issues. But if you have a partner or more than one partner, you need to think about potential worst case scenarios, because once you move forward, you're essentially getting married to this person.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, and if they don't bring the effort to their side of the marriage, you can have real problems. So we see a lot of businesses in the U.S. that have what are called zombie partners. And these are partners, who originally were there. The business didn't grow in the manner that they thought, or maybe there were disputes between the founders as to which way the business should go, and they stopped showing up, or they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Now, legally, usually you can fire them from an employment position, but they're still going to have an ownership interest in the business. And so, how do you get them out? Well, if you don't have a document in writing, you're going to end up in court. That's really the only way to do it. There's going to be default rules and regulations in your state. Each state has something a little bit different. And then a judge who knows nothing about your business, nothing about the history of what's gone on between the founders, is going to try and figure out how to divide up the business and get that person out and what they should be paid and so on and so forth. Right. And the end result is you usually spend a lot of money on attorneys, and almost nobody's happy with whatever the judge comes up with.
Right.
So the most important aspect of that is, if you're going to form a corporation, you want to sit down and do a shareholder agreement. If you're going to do a partnership, it's a partnership agreement. If it's an LLC, you can call it the founders agreement, whatever you call it.
Right.
Once in writing addressing these issues, because that way, if you get 6 months down the line and one of the partners is not showing up, well, you have a process for booting them out the door. And that's incredibly important, because if you're moving forward, I don't care how successful the business is. Well, that's probably not true. If you're incredibly successful, you don't really care. But anything less than that, if you have somebody that you're dragging as an anchor, that's really going to sour you on the business. It's just the nature of it. So that's incredibly important. In the online arena, another area which is, you would think is common, but I see people all the time that don't have it, is insurance.
Okay.
Really want to get liability insurance. Liability insurance is important for two reasons. One, it's going to pay any judgment or settlement against you. But two, it's going to pay your defense fees, your attorney's fees for defending a claim. Right. So a lot of people, that they see the LegalZoom advice, form an LLC, and they go form an LLC, and then they get sued. And the attorney says, well, that's great, you're an LLC, but I'm going to need $25,000 retainer to defend this.
There it is.
Where are you coming up with that money?
Right.
So with the insurance company, they'll typically work in two ways. One, they'll either fund the attorney, but another way that they often work is they'll have pre-approved attorneys. And so they'll have somebody who's already familiar with your field and that they've already worked out, payment relationship with. And so that makes life a lot easier for you because you're going to be stressed out about the lawsuit anyways. So you won't have that, but the advantage of having that insurance policy there, when we went back and we were talking about, doing preventive legal services, well, insurance is kind of part of that, because you never know. There are literally a million different laws. And right now, probably everybody listening to this is violating some of them. I'm an attorney. I'm probably violating some of them. You just don't know. There could be some strange law in Florida or somewhere that is out there. And Florida does have some strange laws. So it's important to, make sure you get liability insurance put in place. And you want to have somebody look at it, either yourself or somebody else, that when somebody offers you a policy, you want to actually read the policy and make sure that it covers, what your risks are. so you don't end up standing there, when you get sued with a policy that doesn't really cover, the problem that you're facing. And that can happen sometimes. And that's obviously a real problem that a lot of people, run into. And then with your website or your app, you want to have terms and a privacy policy. If you have a blog or you have something where people don't really interact, you don't always need terms. And the reason for that is because the terms often aren't going to be effective anyways. Courts are saying now that they want to see users, people who visit websites, they need to essentially check a box. You'll see this on some websites where you have to check a box saying, I agree to the terms and conditions and privacy policy. A lot of courts are saying if that doesn't happen, then your terms and privacy policy aren't binding. And so they're kind of a waste. Now, some blogs, you want to have them anyways, just because they have a prophylactic effect, if you will. People will see them and think, oh, they're bound by these documents. But, terms and privacy policy, they're dry. I realize they're dry legal documents and nobody really is interested in them, but they're there to protect you. If you have an Apple product, you go to iTunes or whatever, they make you agree to their terms every 3 days because they've updated something. Well, they're doing that because it protects them. And so This is your chance to protect yourself. And so you want to have these documents. With the privacy policy, you have to have privacy policy. It's required as law by a number of states. The FTC wants to see it. And even if you don't care anything about that, Google considers its presence to be a ranking factor. So if you want to get SEO rankings, you need a privacy policy. Now, admittedly, it's not a huge ranking factor, but it needs to be there. And then with privacy policy, you're getting into, unfortunately, all kinds of complexities now because there's World War III is kind of underway, and it's online, and it's in the field of privacy of all things, which nobody would have ever predicted. But you're seeing different regions are requiring different things from a privacy perspective. In the U.S., we have almost no privacy laws. We do for some very specific things, like if you're collecting information from kids or health records or something like that. But we don't have an overriding national privacy law. Well, other countries and other regions do. The EU views privacy like we view freedom of speech. So they have very explicit rules. And if you're collecting email addresses for your email list, or you're selling into the EU, even if you're offering free things, free ebook, to generate your list, and you have people on there from the EU, well, you're supposed to have a legal basis for collecting their information. And that means that you often have to get manual consent from them before you collect their information. Your cookies on your site, you need to get consent to use those cookies before they start collecting information. This is why you're seeing sites you go to now, you see more cookie pop-ups.
Right.
They're trying to comply with that. And so it's leading to all kinds of difficulties. But just understand that the privacy policies, the days of a short, little, simple privacy policy, unfortunately, are over. This is just an area where you're seeing a revolution in what's required in various countries. Excuse me. And then the DMCA, which we've already talked about, you definitely, if you're allowing users to post anything to your site, get DMCA compliant. It's cheap, and it's giving you immunity from copyright infringement based on things that they upload. So why not? And then the final thing, probably that's kind of not on the usual path, the reoccurring billing model.
Okay.
Recurring billing is, one of the great things ever, particularly if people will stay with you for a while. You can make a lot of money off people. What's important to understand, and a lot of this comes back to the adult industry, there are many states now that require you to put out specific disclaimers if you're going to employ that type of billing method. So what happened in the adult industry was that they would say, well, get a 3-day free trial for $1.95. And you can end your free trial at any time. But if you actually wanted to end that free trial, it was damn near impossible to find the link to do that.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And so you would get billed $39.95 a month, and they made a lot of money. And so these state laws are designed to kind of prevent that. So at the time people sign up for your reoccurring billing, whatever it is, a product or service, you have to have specific disclaimers there. You have to send in the confirmation email, a note saying, basically, here's how you get rid of this. And there's just a lot of requirements there. Now, if you don't meet those requirements, the penalties, depending on the state, in California, the penalty is your charges are viewed as a gift, and the person who has paid that gift has a right to reclaim that gift. So if you've got 500 people who've been paying $29.99 a month for 5 years, Well, those 500 people in a class action lawsuit can get all their money back. That's a painful event.
I bet, for sure.
And you're seeing larger companies get hit with this, Dropbox and other groups, that are kind of targets for this. And it isn't, again, that they're really acting deviously. It's just they're not really aware of the rules and the laws. But they're obviously becoming a bit more aware now. So if you cover,
kind of acting irresponsible in a sense, right? Because not like like making those ways to kind of get out of those contracts readily accessible, for sure.
Yeah. I'll be honest, this is a law that's kind of abused.
Okay.
Because if we're talking about Netflix, you know how to get out of Netflix. You go to your account, and so, but Netflix, I think Netflix was sued under this, in the class action. And are we really doing justice? Anybody knows how to go do that, or if you don't know how, you can certainly find out easily. They're not trying to hide it. They're not being like the adult sites where they've put the link on page 453 that you have to click through to get to, and it's the same color as the background, and so on and so forth. So it is abused quite a bit, but I'd love to tell you my attorney friends are all interested in justice, but quite frankly, a lot of them are interested in what we call witness green, and that would be money. And so if they see these opportunities, they'll certainly go after them. You see trademark trolls and copyright trolls and patent trolls and everything else. And this is certainly one of the business models that's popping up now.
Richard, let me go back to something really quick that you said earlier when you talked about like that 90-day protection for getting things, protected that you create or whatever the case may be. Let's say I'm a blogger out there, right? And I name my blog, I don't know, The Startup Life. Let's just call the blog The Startup Life, right? And I've been writing this blog for let's say 3 years, okay? Let's say somebody comes after those 3 years and creates the Startup Life store, totally different state somewhere else. And then they come and sue me for copyright infringement, whatever the case may be. Am I protected? Or I'm not protected?
Well, in that case, you're probably not looking at copyright. It's probably going to be more of a trademark claim.
Okay.
And at that point, with trademarks unique because it's very time oriented.
Okay.
And trademark, the idea is that you have, so a mark is something that identifies a product or a service in commerce. And the important part of that in trademark law is in commerce, meaning it's being used. And so there's a real emphasis on use. So if you use it and you use it first, then typically that's your mark.
Gotcha.
And if somebody comes along later and tries to use it, they're going to have problems. Now, with trademarks, there are classes, and classes are basically a division of different areas of the commerce market. So there may be a class. Well, there actually is a class for food blogs.
Okay.
And then there's a class maybe for, let's say, travel. Well, if the same phrase is used in the food blog class, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're protected in the travel class, and you're probably not. So let's look at an example. Amazon, obviously, we know what the Amazon store is online. Okay, well, Amazon it's a strong trademark. When you say the word Amazon, almost immediately people associate that with that store. Does that mean that there cannot be a separate company called Amazon River Tours that take people down the Amazon in South America? No. In that situation, it's a different class. It's a different meaning, and people aren't going to confuse, they're very unlikely to confuse those two topics. And so if Amazon tried to go after, the River Group for a trademark infringement, they're probably going to have a difficult time. So in your situation, where if you have a blog that you've been, posting on everything else, and then an online store, which is basically the same niche, the internet niche, comes on and tries to use your name, then you're probably going to have a pretty good claim. The downside of trademark infringement litigation is very expensive.
Gotcha.
You're probably looking at $500,000 or $1 million in legal fees. It goes on and on and on, and there are a lot of specialized elements there. You're going to need to use a special attorney that specializes in that field. But yeah, generally, if you're using it first, you're probably going to be in a good situation. Now, just a caveat, because I'm sure some capitalistic entrepreneurs out there are thinking,
for sure,
go out and start buying domain names for popular businesses, and this was a very popular business model in the early 2000s. But now it's called cyber squatting, and it's something you really don't want to do. Okay. Depending on how old you are, you may know the business model. People would go out and they would buy misspelled, IBM with 2 M's or whatever.
Right.
And try and sit on these domains and then force the companies to buy them. So yeah, you kind of want to avoid that now. It's not in vogue. The other thing that if you have an online business that you may want to think about, there's a entrepreneurial group up in Canada, a domain register, and they have somehow got approval out of ICANN to sell .sucks domains.
Okay.
So you may well want to go up and buy your domain .sucks. So in my case, localinternetLawyer.sucks, what have you, because if somebody gets that domain, their argument would be that it's not trademark infringement or copyright infringement because they're criticizing you. And they would have
Gotcha.
argument. So yeah, that's one you probably want to look at if you want to really protect things.
For sure. Thank you for sharing that. Richard, one of the reasons that I really wanted to bring you on the Startup Life is because, law is something that's like, let's just be honest, it kind of goes over people's heads, or some people kind of find it not necessarily fun to talk about, but you do it in a very humorous and very approachable way. Where does that come from, man? Is like, do you come from like a humorous family? Or are you like a stand-up comedian on the side? Where does that come from?
I don't know. Just probably my personality, to be honest. When I first started out, I tried to be the traditional attorney.
Okay.
And it was a very three-piece suit and, what have you. But, once I took the sabbatical and started thinking about, what it was that I wanted to do, I kind of decided that, I didn't want to do that anymore. It was all kind of a facade, and I still have plenty of facades, but that was one that I decided to abandon and try to be more reachable for people. Some people like it, some people don't. And I tell clients pretty much up front, if you're expecting me to show up to meetings in a three-piece suit, it's just not going to happen.
Gotcha.
I'm at that point in my life where I don't really need to do that. I don't have business cards. It's just, I'm at that point. And completely honest, some companies are comfortable with that. Some really are not.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because the formality of certain companies, particularly if the companies have been around for longer.
Right.
That they have certain culture and expectations, regarding people. So if the lawyer shows up and, just came from the beach, it's not really tying into their culture.
Right, for sure.
Regardless of what you're telling them. And that's fine, because to be honest, those are kind of companies I typically don't really want to work with. I hate meetings. I just hate
Gotcha.
Meetings. Endless meetings where nobody has the authority to make the actual decision. I get what I call meeting rage, and I moved in a different direction, and some people like it, some people don't. But
we have a lot of teachers who listen to the Startup Life, so they probably know a thing or two about meeting rage for sure.
Yes, it's a real medical problem, I think. Best treated with wine.
Understood, for sure. Let me ask you this, man. I believe all entrepreneurs have a superpower. What's yours and why?
A superpower? What is mine? Wow, that is a fascinating question. I think my superpower these days is the ability to focus.
I hear that.
When you work online, even as an attorney, there are so many shiny objects that you can end up wasting, an ungodly amount of time on. And sometimes, in my case, it's because I have developed the discipline to do that. And other times it's because, I've deleted all messaging services from any of my devices.
Right.
Because I don't have that discipline. But I think focus. And I think for entrepreneurs, one of the things that I see from the legal side, particularly when you start out, is, the internet can be overwhelming in a good and bad way, but there's so much information out there and there's so many different ways to approach things, whether it be marketing or whatever, that, you can get bogged down and actually end up doing almost nothing because, you're trying 12 different things at once. Really focusing, understanding what you want from your business, what your goal is, how are you going to get there, and then sticking with the plan. That is incredibly important. It sounds like a basic thing, but for a lot of people, and myself included, it's easy to get sidetracked and, next thing you know, 6 hours have passed. You haven't gotten anything done. And, that cat video is humorous.
For sure. Anyway, once again, want to thank you for coming on the Startup Life powered by the Binge Podcast Network. Any last nuggets of wisdom you want to share with our audience, Richard?
I think that the one thing I would recommend is that if you're thinking about starting a new business, sit down with an internet lawyer for just an hour, even if you have to pay them, be a couple $100. Tell them what you're doing. Now, there's something called the attorney-client privilege. Right. What that means is they can't disclose, what you tell them, and they also can't use it. So you don't need non-disclosures. You're not giving anything away. but you want to talk to them, tell them exactly what you're doing so they can look at it and they can say, okay, yeah, that looks great. Or they can say, there's a law in this area that you need to be aware of.
Gotcha.
And a potential risk, just so you know what that risk is. So let me give you an example of kind of how that works out. The guys that started Uber, if they sat down with somebody would have told them, you're going to have a problem with the drivers because the drivers, you want to classify them as independent contractors, but some of those drivers are eventually going to want to be classified as employees. And that radically changes the bottom line for Uber because you have employment taxes and things of that sort. And so they would have then had the ability to say, okay, well, here's the risk. Do we go ahead anyways or not? They're making an informed decision, and obviously it's worked out for them. The thing you really want to avoid is where you just don't know there's an issue and you go firing off and, and then suddenly, the attorney general's on the phone. That's where you don't want to be. So
Absolutely.
Sitting down and making sure that you talk to somebody, a lot of internet lawyers will give you a free hour, a free half hour, just to give you an introduction and at least look at things, just to make sure that there isn't anything that you're going to run into problems with. Because, the early 2000s, it was the wild, wild web. Unfortunately, right now we're kind of in the Empire Strikes Back period of the internet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're coming out for everything and they're coming fast. And so you want to make sure that you're on top of that and that there's anything in your business model that's going to get you in trouble.
For sure. Once again, Richard, thank you for coming on the show. Did you enjoy it, man?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Alrighty. All right, Startup Nation.
So here's my final take. There are entrepreneurs who are just like some of those amazing, approachable people that you'll ever come across. Richard is one of those people. Like, when he talks about how he doesn't he hates meetings, he gets meeting rage and stuff like that, or he likes to kind of show up, not necessarily in the full suited and booted suit and tie, but kind of like something that makes him more relaxed. Those are the type of people that have personalities that are super approachable. They're very laid back and they honestly just want to help. I think the amazing thing about Richard, and maybe it's because he's an attorney, but I love the way how he stays abreast of current situation and current law, so that way he can proactively help his client base and his customers. Startup Nation, that is how you anticipate needs before your customers even know that they even needed them. If you want to let us know what you think about the show, have an idea for a show topic, or like to advertise on our show, please send us a message on the Startup Life Podcast Facebook page. And while you are there, like and follow our page as well. It's a way for us to engage with you, Startup Nation, and really grow our community. The link is here in the show notes. Subscribe to the show, as it can now be heard on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or whatever your favorite platform to get your podcast on. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts and you find our content valuable, please give us a 5-star rating, as it will help us climb the charts and help more people find our show. Also, don't forget to sign up for the Startup Life All Access Pass to get exclusive content. This is exclusively on the Binge Podcast Network's Patreon page. And hey, if you have an idea, be about that life. The Startup Life.